One of the more mysterious sayings of Jesus in the New Testament is the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah is found in the Gospel of Matthew. One second here. Yeah, the sign of Jonah is found, in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 16, where Jesus says, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." This is also found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verse 20, verse 20, 29 to 30. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verse 29 to 30, where it says, "This is an evil generation. It seeks for a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of Jonah, the prophet. For Jonah became a sign to the Nivites, so also the Son of Man will be to this generation." So basically, the sign of Jonah. Now, what is the sign of Jonah? Uh, well, according to the Christian commentators, which I read over the years, they were saying that this is Jesus, that Jesus is predicting his resurrection. But the issue here is that notice what Jesus is saying. He's saying no sign shall be given except the sign of Jonah. Now, some say the sign of Jonah was his symbolic resurrection from the dead. If you read the book of Jonah, which is in the Old Testament, if you read the book of Jonah, chapter 2, the book of Jonah, chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, the Hebrew word Sheol can be translated as the grave. So Jonah knew that without God's dramatic intervention, his life would be over. So basically, the whole thing is that the sign of Jonah is not talking about a literal resurrection here. The sign of Jonah is talking about a figurative, resurrection from the dead. In other words, Jesus, the sign of Jonah, as quoted by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, Jesus is actually predicting his escape from death, or him being saved from death, and he's not predicting his death and resurrection, or his literal death and his literal resurrection. How I know this is, or how we can know this is, if we read the Q Gospel. The Q Gospel predates the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. According to the Q Gospel, the sign of Jonah was just the sign of Jonah. It didn't have anything about 3 days and 3 nights. So basically, the sign of Jonah, was a statement about Jesus. According to some scholars, the sign of Jonah refers to both the rescue from death and the coming judgment. It had nothing to do with like a literal resurrection. If resurrection is alluded to there, it was talking about a figurative resurrection, not a literal resurrection. Um, you know, so basically, that's the whole issue here. So the sign of Jonah amounts to a refusal of a sign to warn this generation in advance of the Son of Man's coming. So basically, this had nothing to do with Jesus's literal resurrection. It had to do with the sign of Jonah had to do with Jesus' escape from death. Instead of him being literally killed. So basically, the sign of Jonah had nothing to do with like a literal resurrection. It had to do more with a symbolic resurrection, or a metaphorical resurrection, or an escape from death. We further read this, so basically, even getting to the Jewish traditions about Jonah, right? The Jewish traditions about Jonah, shows that Jonah actually, the prophet Jonah was rescued from the sea as an ascent in the book of Jonah, chapter 2, verse 7, or which held that he entered the Garden of Eden alive. According to the Jewish commentary, which is the Midrash on Psalms chapter 26, verse 7, to explain why Jonah is the figure to whom the Son of Man is compared. So basically, it had to do with the sign of Jonah had to do with judgment, repentance, and an escape from death. So my understanding about the sign of Jonah is that the sign of Jonah, that when Jesus says no sign shall be given to an evil and wicked generation, no sign shall be given except the sign of Jonah, Jesus is actually predicting his escape from death, not his literal death, and his escape from death and his ascension into heaven. So basically, there was something. There was also something in the Q Gospel called the Jerusalem Lament. The Jerusalem Lament says that people will not see Jesus until the end of time. So basically, the end of time. The Jerusalem. Well, let's just read the Jerusalem Lament. Let me just pull that up real quick. Hang on one second. All right, 1 second here. Okay, here we go. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 37 to 39, records Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. So let me just read that verse real quick. Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not." Hang on, let me just get the exact verse here. Okay, he says, Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 37 to 39, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as hens gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This is further found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 13, verses 31 to 35. So basically, there was a PhD thesis done by somebody named Daniel A. Smith in 2001, where he says the post-mortem vindication of Jesus in the sayings Gospel of Q. So basically, the Gospel of Q lacks, a passion. The Gospel of Q predates the New Testament. It was the earliest document written. It was the earliest Christian document, or it was the earliest New Testament document written before Paul, the letters of Paul, before the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, before Acts of the Apostles, before the book of Revelation, before 1 Timothy, 1 Peter, etc., etc. So basically, before any of the New Testament was written, there was this document called the Q Gospel. And the Q Gospel lacked the passion narrative. The Q Gospel didn't have anything about Jesus' death and resurrection. Rather, according to this PhD dissertation, the Q Gospel actually talked about Jesus' disappearance from the tomb, as opposed to, or Jesus' disappearance from earth into heaven, as opposed to Jesus literally dying and Jesus literally being resurrected after the third day. So he goes into how the lament over Jerusalem talks about this. Then he talks about assumption language used in the Old Testament, like Enoch was assumed into heaven without dying in the book of Genesis. Elijah was taken up into heaven without dying, according to the Old Testament, etc., etc. So basically, according to Old Testament theology, people were taken into heaven alive without dying. The most famous case being, Elijah and Enoch, according to the, canonical Old Testament documents. So basically, there was the earliest form of like what happened to Jesus, after his crucifixion was he was taken, he was probably put into a tomb, and from the tomb, God took Jesus from the tomb into heaven. So Jesus disappeared from the tomb and he went to heaven. So God took Jesus into heaven from the tomb. Later on, it was Paul who came up with Jesus dying by crucifixion and being resurrected from the dead. Notice how Paul was the one who was saying this, and his sources were actually not the disciples, but his own reading of the Old Testament and his own subjective visions. The disciples didn't write anything down, so who knows what the disciples were teaching about Jesus' last days. If we read 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 1 to 8, Paul says where he got his gospel from his reading of the Old Testament and his own subjective private visions. We also read this in Romans, Galatians. For example, in Galatians, I believe in Galatians chapter 1, Paul says that he didn't learn the gospel from any man, but he learned the gospel from a revelation from Jesus. A revelation from Jesus means that a revelation in New Testament terminology means a vision or a subjective or a personal vision. So that's what started Christianity, was Paul's reading of the old, or that's what started the whole concept of Jesus' resurrection, was Jesus' death and resurrection was Paul's visions and Paul's reading of the Old Testament. So the person who corrupted the whole message of Jesus was Paul, but that's a completely different topic. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the PhD dissertation in the comment or in the description box below. It's a really good dissertation. Let me see how many pages it is. It's kind of a long dissertation. It's about hang on one second. It's about 329 pages, maybe 333 pages. Yeah, 329 pages. But it's a good read for anybody who wants to understand what happened to Jesus according to the earliest documents. The earliest documents were the Q Gospel, not the letters of Paul or the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was a document called the Q Gospel, which was probably written in either Aramaic or Greek. Now you might say, how come we don't have this Q Gospel? Because the Q Gospel was quickly lost or destroyed, in the first few years of Christianity. So the Q Gospel probably originated by the disciples or disciples of the disciples, and it quickly got lost, or it was quickly destroyed, or it was quickly lost. Keep in mind, we have no original New Testament documents. We don't have any of the autographed manuscripts of the New Testament. So this is further proof that the earliest gospel, which was the Q Gospel, was destroyed or lost, just as the original New Testament documents were destroyed and lost in the first few years of the church, of the first few years of the New Testament. What we have is, are like tiny scraps or tiny fragment manuscripts of the New Testament, like P52, P46, etc. P52 is just a very tiny fragment of the Gospel of John, which is like barely a few sentences of the Gospel of John. So none of the earliest New Testament manuscripts exist. They were all lost or destroyed in the first 20 or 30 years or 40 years of Christianity. Same thing with the Q Gospel. So this is further indication, or this is further evidence that the Q Gospel was in circulation and it was destroyed or lost. Just like the New Testament, the autographed New Testament manuscripts were destroyed and lost as time, as the years went on, as the early years went on, or the early years of Christianity went on. Then the other evidence we have for the Gospel of Q is the beginning of Luke. If you read the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, Luke says that, or the anonymous author of Luke says that he used other sources to write up his gospel. So it stands to reason that it's possible that that the author of Luke had this gospel, this Q gospel in Greek, because whoever wrote the Gospel of Luke was pretty good at writing Greek, reading and writing Greek. So it's possible that this Q Gospel was circulating in Greek from an Aramaic oral source, or an Aramaic, probably an Aramaic oral source. The reason why I say this is because the disciples of Jesus didn't know how to read and write. They were illiterate, so they were probably telling stories about Jesus in Aramaic oral traditions, and some people who converted to Christianity, who spoke and wrote Greek, wrote down their sayings in this Q gospel, and this Q gospel was quickly lost, as time went on. Anyways, the anonymous author of the Gospel of Luke probably had access to the Gospel of Q, and he was writing this material down, but he was drawing on other sources too. He was drawing on oral sources that talked about Jesus' death and resurrection. So he put that into his gospel too, because that was the prevailing gospel. Paul's gospel was the prevailing gospel, that Jesus died and was resurrected. So the anonymous author of Luke probably heard that and wrote that down in his gospel, as that gospel was circulating in Greek, probably, or Paul's gospel was circulating in Greek, probably by his letters, or probably by oral traditions that were circulating in Greek and Aramaic and stuff like that. So this is just my 2 cents on the whole sign of Jonah and Jesus' disappearance, etc., etc. I made a video about this last year. If you want to see that video, just search my video. It's called The Crucifixion and Resurrection of Jesus in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 157. So this is just, the whole thing is just, it's very fascinating. The earliest form of Christianity, or how Christianity got off, and how Christianity started, and how it exploded in the first 50 years, or the first 100 years. There were complications in the church, and basically the disciples were teaching one thing about Jesus, and Paul was teaching another thing about Jesus, and Paul's gospel beat out the disciples' gospel, disciples' teachings about Jesus, etc. So the whole thing's just a very the whole Christian tradition is based on the fact that history is written by the victors. So Paul was the most successful Christian missionary out there, so that's why his gospel was the prevailing one, and the true gospel, the gospel of the disciples, faded away as time went on. So the whole thing is Paul's gospel beating out the disciples' gospel, and leading to the confusion of the crucifixion and resurrection, or leading to the gospel of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So I'm going to leave the dissertation, or the PhD dissertation, below, and let me know your thoughts about this Q gospel and what the sign of Jonah means. I'm looking forward to your thoughts.